Welcome, nutritionradio.org listeners. This is Lonnie Lowry, University Nutrition Professor of over 20 years and podcast host of long-running shows like Iron Radio. Come on in. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Nutrition Radio. This is Lonnie Lowry. You know from the intro, I am a professor of about 25 years now. I'm a food industry and academic consultant. And we have Abbie again in our last month of season 2.
I'm Abbie. I study exercise science, and I love science.
Cool. All right. So that's what we're going to talk about today, some science. Here are our topics just quickly, everybody, so you can decide if you want to stick around. In our food trend, sourdough. This is a big deal. I have some hipster friends who love to talk about their sourdough starters and that kind of stuff. I have not experimented with it directly, but we will talk about sourdough. In the breaking science, we've got diet and autoimmune function. So there's some surprising connections between diet and the environment and all the complex natures of the immune system, right? It's just so hard. My own family struggles with autoimmune conditions, and I can't wait to hear about some of the science because it's so complex. Like, what endpoint do you even measure? Is it, inflammation or some cytokine or, symptoms or whatever? So we'll talk about diet and immune conditions. In the weight management tip, we've got a way for you to, let's just say it has to do with storing and reheating your rice and what that might do for weight control. Very interesting. And then in the recipe, we've got pumpkin spice ice cream, protein pumpkin spice ice cream. Let's not forget the protein part. Perfect time of year, and Abbie will tell us about that. So, part 1 here in our first segment, food trend. What made you think about sourdough, and what do you have for us?
Market news, food and fitness trends.
So on Instagram, when I see the multiple food videos, food connoisseurs, a lot of people choose to make their own sourdough. And I think this has been going on since probably 2020, especially, is where I saw like a pretty big resurgence. I think at that time it was just something to do in your house. If you had the time, you could make some sourdough bread. And we were all at home. So definitely big then. But I think now it's a little bit more of a health movement where people are making the claims that making your own sourdough is like far healthier than store-bought. Most of them coming from there being just simply less preservatives and additives and et cetera, et cetera. So I kind of wanted to do an overall comparison of the pros and cons of buying your own sourdough bread versus making your own sourdough bread.
It just seems so labor intensive. Oh my gosh. Like you have to keep feeding it, if you will. And
yes.
So what are some of the claims, and what do you have there?
So I believe it's the fermentation process that helps to sort of break down the gluten prior to the bread actually forming. So it has lower levels of gluten, which I know some people have some slight intolerances to, so that could be helpful. It also offers prebiotic fiber, I believe, from the fermentation process, and lower glycemic load because there is added fiber, but I'm sure you could get that from a few other types of breads as well. And then just overall added nutrients. I believe there's magnesium in there, iron, definitely some added nutrients that you can't really find in your regular white bread.
Right. My understanding for a long time was that, you could get like a commercial version of the necessary like bacteria or yeast or whatever, or you can just kind of do this with your own flour and rely on the local microbiota to grow and naturally. And then that's where you get this kind of bragging rights from these little bakeries and stuff about, we have a starter. We've used this for like the last 10 years, 15 years, I don't know, whatever. And they just kind of keep it going because they've got the right blend of quote unquote bugs, if you will, of microorganisms and that kind of stuff. It always just seemed like such a huge thing. I mean, you just mix the water with the flour, and I'm not very educated on this. We have listeners, by all means, write in and let us know. And then you would just kind of let that sit day 1, day 2, and it just kind of ferments, and then you remove like half of it and you keep putting in more flour and more water. Presumably because the microorganisms that started growing in day 1 or day 2 are there, and you're just kind of feeding them more flour, more water, and then the CO2 makes bubbles, right? Or that's why you get it's so porous. So you haven't done this yourself in like experimenting in your kitchen though, right?
No, I have tried someone else's homemade sourdough bread, but I have never made it myself.
Okay. My understanding is like on the first day or two that you try to do this, you're kind of smelling it to see if it starts getting that clean, sour smell, because
Hmm.
it can also go bad. What kind of freak me out is, well, what if the wrong bacteria grow in there? Like
Yeah,
I don't want to eat something spoiled, because
yeah.
have you had a microbiology class?
Yep, yep.
It's been so long since I looked at any micro stuff. I'm just thinking, I don't know. Obviously, it's something that people do. Uh,
Hmm.
Not everybody has to have a food science degree, for God's sake, to do this kind of stuff. I do like the flavor. I like sourdough bread, like sourdough toast and that kind of stuff. It's just got that kind of, is it acetic acid or lactic acid, or there's some type of acids that get formed, I believe, and
I
that's why it has that tang.
I know that one point that they made was when you buy your sourdough bread from the store, that sometimes they can just put the sour starter itself in without really doing the fermentation process, and
Oh,
it'll give the flavor. And that's where a lot of people who make their sourdough bread are coming from, saying that it's healthier, is because some of these grocery stores aren't actually doing the fermentation process. They're just giving sourdough bread flavors, and then they don't
oh,
have like those benefits as well. So I can try to find
yeah.
out.
Oh, shady. That is shady. That reminds me
Yeah.
of like, in class, sometimes I talk about wheat bread. If you don't go look at the fiber content, or if you don't look at the ingredients list, not the macros, but the ingredients, and if it doesn't say 100% whole wheat bread, it can just be brown dyed white bread, so people are just missing the mark. It's like, what is all bread? Wheat. It's all made of wheat, so people buy brown
Hmm.
dyed white bread. It kind of makes me think about what you're saying there, right? Like, oh, it's
Yep.
just sourdough flavored. What?
Yep.
Because to me, the whole idea there would be a slow, like you're getting the leavening not from baking soda or something. It's a slow process. It's supposed to be somehow better tasting and better for you
Yep.
because of the slow fermentation and stuff, and the slow leavening effect. That when you actually use it, in a recipe, when you pull out some of your starter and actually bake with it, I'll have to look into see, what I can find as far as some of the, like, what's the glycemic of sourdough versus white bread, versus a whole
Hmm.
grain bread. Listeners, if you're interested, there is a website called Mendoza.com, and this guy has huge lists from, I don't know if it's USDA or some type of huge database of like glycemic index, glycemic load for all these different foods. But I'm sure there's a million ways to look at this now online. It's a good topic because I've never quite understood the nuances of sourdough starters and all the claims that are made. And most of what I've heard from kind of my more hippie friends, it tastes so good. It's your own local collection of microorganisms, and it's somehow healthier or better tasting because of the leavening. It's just more slow acting, and it sounds very kind of custom and bespoke as far as local foodies and how they would embrace that kind of stuff. Yeah, I didn't even think about what you said about the pandemic, Abbie. Like, people would have time to keep pulling away. I think it's like half of it. After you get it started, your flour and water, you pull off like half of it, and you just keep adding more flour and water. But you're doing it, I think, almost daily, aren't you? And I mean, who's got the time for that? And the pandemic, that would make sense, what you're saying. If it really kicked up in 2020, people have time. They're stuck at home or they're working remote.
I was gonna say, that local sense, like if you want that localness to your bread, I would almost contact a local baker and maybe find out how they make their sourdough bread. Because to me, that that's a pretty lengthy process, and I don't know if some more nutritious bread is worth all that time.
Yeah, it would have to be way more nutritious, and I'm not sure it would be. Yeah, because there's
Yeah.
local bakers they've got that really down to an art form, I would think.
Hmm.
Yeah. Okay. All right, let's move on to our second segment here, diet and autoimmune conditions. So you sent a link, and I just started to look at it.
Breaking nutrition science.
So we know that in westernized societies, the incidence of autoimmune diseases is on the rise, and they're really trying to tease apart the environmental factors that are kind of contributing to this, because they see that, autoimmune diseases, if they're increasing in developed countries, there must be some sort of environmental interplay there. And so diet being so different from developed countries versus underdeveloped countries is kind of where this article focuses in on. And they really start to mention the increased intestinal permeability induced by industrial additives with the tight junctions in the intestines opening up. And they think that the food antigens are kind of getting to places, being introduced to the immune system when they're not usually, and you're having reactions to these immunogenic antigens. And it's sort of kind of like that molecular mimicry hypothesis is going on for the autoimmune diseases and food relationships.
Right. I have read that there are different emulsifiers. Like I went to an NIH conference once and they were talking about carboxymethylcellulose. It's in a lot of stuff, ice cream. And, it's an emulsifier. It makes fats and water-based things play nice and about how it can kind of attack, if you will, the mucus lining of your intestines and make you more vulnerable, right? Like those intestinal cell junctions that you need to protect you, like this barrier. Because, people don't really think, I don't believe, that your digestive tract, very much unlike your bloodstream, it's open to the environment on both ends, and bacteria are growing in there, especially late stage small intestines and really the large intestines, the colon. And you need that kind of barrier to protect you. And if additives are messing with the mucus barrier, I can see how that could cause some problems because there's different immune system. They say like 70% of your immune system is basically located in your gut, with gut-associated lymphoid tissue, GALT. Did the article talk much about what we can do, or is it just sort of pointing out that, hey, Western diets are bad for this?
It was more just pointing out. I know they did mention some stuff about fiber and how the lack of fiber in a lot of Western diets could increase the secretion of enzymes that also contribute to degradation of that mucin layer in the intestine. So they didn't outright, I think, say eat more fiber, but I think anybody who read that would probably register in their head, maybe I should eat some more fiber to increase that mucin layer, not let things get past that shouldn't get past, I suppose.
Right.
But not only did they also mention that it's not only is it letting things pass that shouldn't get past, but also there's some malabsorption going on with this decreased mucin in the intestines. So there's some particular nutrients where if you're deficient in them, autoimmune diseases have you have a greater risk of developing, like I think it was rheumatoid arthritis and multiple sclerosis, especially with deficiencies in vitamin D, for example. So I'm sure there's a bunch of other relationships, but that's a big one that they have pointed out.
Yeah, it does. One of the things I always wonder about, whether it's autoimmune or otherwise, because my family deals with some of this, like, the women in my family, not all of them, but about half of them have lupus, and lupus can be absolutely deadly to women, or it can be sort of this, sometimes they call it like the great mimicker or whatever. Lupus literally translates to wolf, which is very scary, But at least in my family, some of the women, it's more like kidney scarring, lung scarring. It's clearly their immune system is attacking their own bodies, but not in such a way that they die very quickly. And that can happen, And not that men can't get lupus, it's just mostly women. But it does make you wonder, like, if there's more autoimmune disease in people who are genetically predisposed, do you avoid things like those emulsifiers? Do you pursue good things like more prebiotic fibers? Clearly you could do both. A lot of the stuff I've seen is like, the latitude thing. Like typically if you live above, I don't know, it's like 35 degrees or whatever in the winter of latitude, not Fahrenheit, but latitude degrees, then you don't get enough sunshine. There's a vitamin D connection with autoimmune. And obviously there's the kind of fats we eat. I think people evolved to eat way more omega-3s than we eat. I gave my mom a paper not long ago about how I just saw it recently, how olive oil consumption reduces reoccurrence or flare-ups of autoimmune symptoms. And so I think dietary fats are a big part of this too. Fibers, fats, whether it's the monounsaturates from olive oil or it's some of the omega-3s from fish oils and that kind of stuff. For me, a lot of this is kind of joint-related stuff. I mean, there's no rheumatoid arthritis in my family, but there's still a lot of osteoarthritis and, inflammation and these pro-oxidative effects seem to be rampant in current society because of all the things, the low fiber, the fat imbalance, if you will, kinds of fats that we're eating, all that kind of stuff. Did the paper mention it at all about what percentage of the population? I know that's a very specific question, or any other juicy tidbits about the diet and autoimmune connection?
Yeah, so I think they had 3 to 5% of the population has autoimmune diseases, but they predict it's going to be increasing. I know when I worked in a lab this past summer where they did strictly Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis research, which some IBD, IBS, which are typically considered autoimmune, they said that somewhere around 21% of the population probably has some sort of IBS disorder, but they are just underdiagnosed because it's so hard and there's not really anything you can do for IBS specifically.
Right.
So there's those numbers being thrown around. Not sure which one's accurate, but it's pretty interesting just seeing how these are they're just increasing and especially with the diagnosis being so difficult for many of them, that's where I think science is struggling, because how are you supposed to study something where you can't really seek out everyone who has it? Right.
And like I said, it's so complex. There's so many endpoints. I mean, if you watch some cytokine or T helper cell or something go up or down, is that relevant clinically and to whom? And it's just so complex. The immune system has, I bought, you'll appreciate this. When I was an undergrad, I was out at NeoMed. At the time, it was Neo-UCOM, a local medical school for everybody else. And I bought a book on immunobiology, and I just used my own money. I was just a nerd. I just wanted to read it, and I'm reading this and thinking, this is so complex. Immune function is crazy complex. And then working in the food industry, you can see how it becomes a challenge to make different immune claims without crossing into sort of drug claim territory, which is a no-no for supplements and foods, And it's just so complicated. But it is disturbing. I guess the take home for me, what you're saying is that these are on the rise. We're living in an increasingly fake environment, and we're not getting the stuff that we evolved to need, Wow. Yeah. So exposures on one side and then not getting certain things on the other. You know what? The other last thing, this is a tangent, but when it comes to IBS specifically, it always confused me just a little bit. There are FODMAP diets that are basically avoiding fermentable fibers. And I was always of the opinion, wait a minute, I thought those were good for your immune system health. So there must be some fine line between, stuff like inulin, classic prebiotic fermentable fiber. It's good for a lot of people, but too much of these fermentable fibers, the kinds of food you would avoid in a FODMAP diet, too much obviously cause irritation and cause problems too. So it must be whether you have it versus you don't, and whether or not those are good or not. Because I always found that those FODMAP diets, I'm like, God, I would have to eliminate so many healthy foods and fibrous foods and fruits and vegetables, and what? You can't do that for very long. And I know you're eventually then you kind of normalize your diet with those kinds of things. Maybe I should look to get some expert on the show about, FODMAP stuff, but
that'd be interesting.
Okay. Next up, weight management tip. So you mentioned reheating rice to reduce the glycemic load and the calorie value.
Weight management tips.
That's very interesting to me. I've heard about freezing and, that kind of stuff as far as reducing the glycemic index and whatnot. But what do you have here?
So I noticed that a lot of people were present on social media, or just they would take their cooked rice, and prior to even eating it, they would mix it with a little bit of coconut oil and just put it in the refrigerator and let it cool down. And when I looked up some of the science behind this, they said that the starch in the rice is going under a process known as retrogradation, where instead they reverse the gelatinization and the reassociation of the amylose and amylopectin molecules, which they start to form a more ordered structure. So they kind of align themselves in a helical pattern sort of thing, crystalline structure, and they form resistant starches, which we know have a lower glycemic index compared to the original uncooked rice right after you cook it, for example. And this can give you some benefit to slower and steadier rises in blood sugar levels, but also the way your body decides to absorb the calories could be influenced by the presence of the resistant starch, because some studies suggest that resistant starch may have a lower caloric impact than regular starch because it's not fully absorbed in the small intestine, which then may contribute to fewer, I guess, metabolizable calories, but the overall calorie content is technically the same, but metabolizable calories probably maybe
Right.
a little bit less. And I mean, if you have the time, if you're gonna maybe meal prep for the week, why not try it out, you know?
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, I had heard, yeah, if you freeze like a loaf of white bread and then you eat it,
Mhm.
it's just got a lower glycemic index. But this whole idea of reheating, it would reduce it even more. This is very cool stuff. And this is a practical tip I think listeners could experiment with in their own kitchen, like,
Yeah.
oh, I can freeze and then reheat stuff like bread or rice. And, it's just going to help on the weight control side, you would think. I mean, from what I understand about different carbohydrates is that, they'll range from like a lot of fibers we often think are essentially no calories. Typically, they have about 2 calories per gram. Even fibers that you can't digest will become short chain fatty acids when they interact with your gut, acetate and butyrate and that kind of thing. But yeah, and then here you've got, I don't know, it's just a practical tip. So you get something that's 4 calories per gram, like a regular starch. And then who knows, even if it's 3, that's fewer available grams, if you will, of carbs. And that's the kind of stuff that people got to look at. I mean, a lot of our listeners also listen to Iron Radio. And for years, I've talked about on that podcast, like when it comes to getting lean and dieting for competition and all that kind of stuff, your protein stays pretty high because that's not particularly fattening, if you will. Fat content can come down a little, but it's not super dramatically fluctuating. It's the carbs that you start cutting. When I talk to people backstage in fitness and figure and bodybuilding contests, and for those of you that are listening and you don't do that, that's fine. I'm just telling you, for these target diets, that's what a lot of these athletes do. They progressively pull out more and more carbohydrates, not all at once because you crush your metabolic rate, I'm afraid, but at least my concern. But then you have this progression model where you pull out a little bit more carbs, a little bit more carbs. This might be a good first step. When you're starting your carb reduction journey, this would be one way that you can eat the carbs, like have your cake and eat it too, have the carb and
There you go.
And less of it's available. That's a good tip. I had not heard about the reheating part.
I wonder what would happen if you were to make maybe a big batch of this rice, and every single time you wanted a portion of it, you reheated the entire thing and took a portion, then cooled the rest. I wonder, like by the end, what would that look like?
Would you have like all resistant starch?
Yeah,
Calorie
just eating
free.
fiber rice.
Right? Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, that'd be a cool study to actually do, wouldn't it? Like successive, progressive reheatings. And does it make it, lower and lower glycemic load? How cool.
Yeah.
All right. We have one last bit here today, and that's your recipe.
Rant, product review, or recipes.
This reminded me of something that I used to do in a sports nutrition class, but it's protein pumpkin spice ice cream. This sounds delicious. I love pumpkin spice stuff this time of year. So, yeah, what's this about?
So first, I just wanted to ask, have you heard of the Ninja Creamy?
No.
It is all the rage. It is
okay.
It purely is, the purpose of it is pretty much making like protein ice cream and smoothie bowls, and it's definitely popularized in young fitness communities, I guess you could say, people take their protein shakes and they pour them into this sort of cylindrical, like almost blender attachment, and you get like 4 or 5 of them. You could pour your protein shake in there, put it in the freezer, pull it out, put it in this machine, and it basically makes it into soft serve. But it is kind of expensive, but there's other ways you can make it. I just wanted to ask if you knew what that was.
I had heard of
cool.
that trend with the Ninja and all that. I have back in the day, we used to do protein shakes. We would set up a table at the field house of the university where I was working, and one of the flavors we did the like a berry, and we did a pumpkin, and you can basically you just throw in about half of the blender full of ice cubes. You throw in a scoop of whey protein, and then I don't know, it might be a cup worth of like pumpkin from a can, almost like a pumpkin pie filling, but it doesn't have to be the super sugary stuff. And you blend it long enough, like 1 to 2 minutes, and it makes this real thick pumpkin spice smoothie. They were delicious. So it sounds like that kind of thing. And for people who, then you get the benefit of the pumpkin. I mean, you hear all kinds of healthy stuff about pumpkin and some of the fiber content, and I've seen some stuff about different components of pumpkins helping with like joint inflammation and, just kind of the phytochemicals and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I hadn't heard that was a trend. It seems like a no-brainer to me that why would you eat sugary ice cream when you can have almost the same taste experience, sensory experience, and you're just having a protein shake.
Yeah.
Have you done anything like this before?
I have. I love the blender protein recipes. I'm always experimenting because it's just kind of fun. And lately, the one that I was going to kind of bring up, this one is a little bit, I would say, closer to the mouthfeel of like scooping ice cream. Like if you were to go to your local ice cream and they do it by the scoop, this one's very similar to that because instead of sort of the base of ice where you're making more of like a frosty or soft serve, the base is like a whole milk cottage cheese, which sounds a little bit weird. Yeah. But you take the cottage cheese, you mix pumpkin puree, some pumpkin spice seasoning, and then your sweetener. So you could do like sugar-free syrup, or you could do honey, maple syrup, and then I think they put vanilla extract in there, and they just blended it together and then froze it. And because there's that fat in the cottage cheese, because you do use whole milk cottage cheese, it does give you kind of that ice cream mouthfeel, but you have so much more protein from the cottage cheese. And they also ended up, I think, blending some graham crackers on top for topping. Ooh. But this one I would say is like, it's a mix in between real ice cream and probably like that protein soft serve you're talking about. So if you kind of aren't a fan of the protein soft serve, this might be another option you could look into to still get your protein kind of nightcap if this is your late night snack.
Yeah, I love the idea. It's like a whole food item, like casein cottage cheese, instead of, you don't have to bust out the scoop of protein powder necessarily. And the thing about the fat, oftentimes we've had people on this show talk about weight gain. Like weight management is weight gain, not just weight loss. And it's really hard to gain weight in a good way. And if you use full fat dairy, you could use that as a weight gain snack, I would think. And it's not just junk, right? Because ice cream doesn't have much protein at all, a little dab. I love that idea. And then, you're right. What I was talking about with those sports nutrition, those pumpkin shakes, because I used to do that, just what you're doing, frozen berries or pumpkin. There's a whole world of recipes out there with protein shakes. But the limitation would be it comes out like a really thick milkshake. It's not – you could spoon it up kind of, but like you said, it's more like a thick shake or a soft serve than something that might be closer to real ice cream, like you actually put in the freezer. That does make sense to me.
You could sprinkle some nuts in there too, maybe, if you're on the weight gain trend.
That's true. Yeah, we could actually kind of think about all the kinds of stuff that you could put in there just for, more calories and that kind of stuff. And, that's true it's not just athletes. I mean, there's a lot of people who need calories. My mom is quite old now, and I'm pushing calories and protein on her all the time, so there's a lot of applications, for that kind of stuff. And the beauty of it is, of course, is the protein part, which is what you brought up to begin with, right? Like, yeah, whether you want to make it higher fat or lower fat or whatever, you can do that. Mm-hmm. The leanness, if you will, of the cottage cheese, or if you want to do it with protein powder or whatever. But yes, if you haven't tried pumpkin flavoring in ice cream, like a shake or something, it's really good. Canned pumpkin is cheap, super healthy, and this time of year, it's really, and it's authentic too. You can actually control the sweetness level, because one of the things, like when I go to Starbucks, for example, I will occasionally get a pumpkin spice latte. I don't really like a lot of milk and sugar in my coffee. I like black coffee, but they're not sickly sweet. And so that's the kind of thing that you could do with this, is you can make your pumpkin spice, you could control the sweetness. Do you want to put a little artificial sweetener in there or not? It's kind of up to you. No, I like it. Pumpkin spice, It's that time of year. Yeah. Well, I guess that's a little shorter episode this week, but this, it doesn't have to be the full 45 minutes. So I appreciate you coming on. I'm going to ask you on air, you might want to think about breaking science. I know you're about to embark on a very cool study that involves ketones and that kind of stuff.
Yes.
So we might even be able to talk about that coming up, because you'll have direct experience, if you're comfortable sharing that stuff, because I know that some of the research is stage, but some of the stuff that you're looking at, and I won't tell listeners yet, but it's surprising what Abbie is looking at when it comes to some of the potential benefits of ketones, ketone supplementation and that kind of stuff. But you could, explain where that came from, and are these products good? I know Mike Nelson over on the other podcast has talked about that, and there's a connection there. So, yeah. So that might be a good science thing to talk about as well. Oh, and next time we're going to do a taste test, everybody. Abbie and I are going to try we're going to try Quorn, Quorn. It's that mycoprotein. I've talked about it on different podcasts. I've never actually tasted it. So it'll be weird to do it in the morning, Abbie. We're having chicken nuggets in the morning. But, we'll give it a go. We'll see if these things taste like chicken or not. It partly made me think about it because you were talking about fake fish recently, and how much does that really differ from a chicken nugget? Chicken nuggets are so processed; they're just kind of all ground up, and rarely do you bite into a chicken nugget and you can identify white breast meat in there. You know what I mean? It's just sort of and so why not? Why wouldn't they use fungal stuff? And we can even read through the box. Like, here's what's in the corn. I know that company. They won some awards and stuff. It's probably very sustainable, but we could talk about pros and cons of that. I actually had to do a deep dive for a food industry project on some of these mycoproteins. I'm very curious about these things, so we'll do a taste test. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for being on, and we'll see everybody next time.
Yeah, thank you.
The nutritionradio.org podcast is for informational purposes only. If you're interested in starting a diet or exercise program, check with your physician, nutritionist, or qualified exercise physiologist in order to make the progress that you need.